So thank you for coming, Mustafa Pulat. Now we can start with the brief interview, if it's okay.
Sure.
So who's gonna
Pleasure.
do the?
Thank you. Okay, so the first question that I'd like to ask you is regarding Turkey's military. Turkey has strengthened its military and economy and achieved a degree of political coherence it has not known in decades. For the first time since the end of World War I, Ankara is beginning to revisit its historical role as a regional powerhouse. How would such a reassertion affect relations between Israel and Turkey?
Yeah. Oh, okay. I agree with you that the economic, financial situation in Turkey has become better. Unfortunately, we've had our crisis in the late 90s and early 2000, and that forced Turkey to pull itself together in terms of its finances, its financial system. We had quite a few banks with huge corrupted loans and credits. So we had to clean up this mess in early 2000. I think that strengthened the Turkish economy and its performance in the following years. We've been enjoying, at this particular point in history, the third single-party rule, which Turkey has not enjoyed for a very long time. Because when you look at the 90s, late 80s, early 2000s, we've had always coalition governments. Right now, the present government is in power third time in a row, and of course, with such kind of political power, you can do a lot in a country like Turkey. Turkey has always been important in its region, but we have been mostly inward-looking in all these decades, and we have been, a friend and ally of the West during the Cold War, but the Cold War circumstances were different, and we were not prepared that the wall came down, and we felt a limbo. But after a short hesitation, Turkey found itself as an island of stability, to say the least, and which can provide security and stability in its whole region. For example, when you look at the Georgia crisis, which took place recently, it was a big, major problem. But with Turkey, I think the crisis settled easier, if I can say. Regarding Turkey's relations with the Middle East, there is a very strong interest to Turkey in the Middle East, I can say that. Turkish soap operas, Turkish movies, other massively consumed cultural products are very much high in demand in the Middle East. We don't know how long this would continue, but at least this is the fashion right now. And the situation in Turkey, the democracy that we have been enjoying since 1950s, over half a century, has become inspirational to the countries of the Middle East. We are happy to see that, but all these countries, they have to have their own experiences. We don't claim to be an example to anyone, because we started with small steps in the early 19th century. We established our first parliament in 19th century, so it's a long process, and it's a process that would obviously change from one country to the other. When we come to the relations between Turkey and Israel, Ottoman Empire, Turks and Jews are good friends all throughout our history. We have all these examples that we can only be proud of, like for example, when the Jews were escaping Inquisition from Spain, they were warmly welcomed by the Sultan in Istanbul, by the Ottoman Empire. They came in tens of thousands. Still, we have a sizable and strong community of Jews living in Turkey. Turkish-Israeli relations with the establishment of the Republic of Turkey has, had ups and downs. The picture was not always very rosy, if I may say. For example, when they declared their capital at Jerusalem, Turkey was one of the countries which did not recognize this. Our embassy is still in Tel Aviv. So we can't say that the relations were always excellent, but they had a strong footing, strong base. And Turkey tried very hard to mediate between Syria and Israel, and also in Palestine. We have invested enormous time and effort to clear the hurdles in front of a wider Middle East peace process. But unfortunately, due to certain political problems that you would know, these efforts could not bear fruit. And I think in this sense, Turkey cannot be blamed for what happened. And in the terms of the Mavi Marmara case, the ferry that was boarded by Israeli commandos, our demands are clear. They have been voiced at the highest level many times. The relationship between Turkey and Israel, this knot could be untangled only when certain conditions were met, as declared by our high-level personalities.
Thank you very much.
Another question is, WTO has been criticized as representing more the interests of rich countries and multinational corporations, which harms developing and small countries who have less negotiating power. Why is this, and what does this say about double standards within the international organizations?
I work for the WTO, so I feel biased to this question, but I work for the Secretariat. It's a highly dedicated, highly professional, a little bit conservative, but a good Secretariat. Unfortunately, these criticisms are there. Partly they are true, but partly not. Because if the small nations had been powerless, or if they had been without any means or instruments to stop the negotiations, then the Doha round would have been completed. The picture in the WTO right now is very different. You have China as member. Yesterday they were going to vote Russia to welcome them in after 16, 18 years or so. So the WTO is not the WTO of the Uruguay round. It has changed a lot. Americans and the West in general, they're not holding the ropes anymore. It's India, it's China, it's African nations, it's the BRIC countries that can exercise enormous power. And when the Russians are in, the BRIC power will be felt more in the WTO. Of course, we can criticize this, particularly the negotiations on agriculture. They were stalled for the simple fact that some rich countries like to subsidize their very rich farmers at the expense of very poor African farmers. This is, one issue. The other issue is, of course, again on agriculture, there is a difference of approach. While the so-called New World, Americans at the top, Canadians, Aussies, in the sense you can add Brazilians and others who support that agricultural markets should be free and fair. But when these demands meet the Europeans, there is a very strong clash. Because the Europeans, as having a very large market of 450 million consumers with high-level incomes, they would like to protect their own traditional ways of producing, living, etc. And the French, the Spanish, and the Italians, they have been in this view. Germans are a little bit different because it's not that they're not doing any farm, but they understand the value of, I think, some of the arguments that are posed by the pro-liberalization in agriculture group. Their situation is a little bit different. But WTO has changed a lot. But this change in itself did not bring successful realization of the negotiation rounds, because when you look at the world scene, in my view, the reason why we are having a huge economic crisis, commercial crisis at this point, is due to the simple fact that the WTO negotiations, Doha round, has stalled. If it had succeeded, I think we would have had more ways, avenues for economic growth, and that would have been felt in all over the world, because the world has to start trading more. But then, it brings you to the other question, that is WTO the playing field of multinational corporations? Multinational corporations, they can be Chinese, they are Brazilian, they are Indian, they are South African. So multinational companies in itself, in themselves, they've changed a lot. So this broad argumentation really, in my view, does not explain today's problematic, because things have changed so much. I mean, but the needs have not changed. The need is, obviously, you need to have more liberal and better integrated markets. And there has to be balances for smaller countries, for poor nations. But that could be achieved. But the real problem is the WTO lost leadership from the US, for the simple fact that the US cannot lead anymore, because there are other major nations. But we don't know as yet if this kind of a multilateral WTO scene is helpful to conclude rounds in a fast and responsible manner. No one can blame anyone in this process, because I worked as a trade negotiator for intellectual property services, other issues. If you leave it to the negotiator, they will try to cut your heart out. But there has to be a political vision at the higher level.
I would like now to attract our attention to Turkey, and from financial issues to cultural issues. It's hard to deny that in Turkey there is a cleavage between secular and non-secular politics since very long time. And do you think that the application of cultural diplomacy is a good tool to cheer up the relationship between these two groups? Would cultural diplomacy, or is there any example of good cultural diplomacy to have a positive communication between two groups, and whether you can think of other tools to make it, a positive atmosphere?
First of all, I don't believe that the divisions between the so-called secular camp and the religious camp is so deep. There are on both sides certain groups, certain individuals, in my personal view, of course, who have a stricter view of what goes on in terms of secularism or religiousness. But for example, in Berlin, in the same family, you would see girls wearing a headscarf and another girl, not wearing a headscarf, with full makeup, having a good life. This is absolutely normal in the Turkish society. I think we have politicized some symbols and some religious political issues too much, to the point that the fragmentation between extreme groups were really too much crystallized. But the way forward is, like you mentioned, cultural diplomacy. But in Turkey, we are highly adaptable people. I mean, who is a Turk? I mean, we have people from Sudan who immigrated after the First World War, when they were fighting for the Ottoman Empire in the Palestinian front, because they couldn't go back. They were settled near Izmir and Antalya. You had Uzbeks, Turkmens and Azeris who were going to the pilgrimage when the Dardanelles War was taking place, and instead of going to the pilgrimage, they went to the front. All these people, they settled, died, or something. So we are a highly mixed society. I mean, 40%, 45% of the Turkish population living in Turkey today originate outside Turkey. Caucasia, the Balkans, partly Middle East, and etc. So in this kind of a really genuinely built-in multiculturalism, I deliberately use these words, the need for a very structured, structured kind of cultural diplomacy, maybe not needed so much. Of course, we needed to improve the understanding between certain groups, but it's not only the more religious people versus the less religious people, or in some cases, between the ethnic groups. In Turkey, we could see that partly the press is doing the job, usually in a good way, in my view. TVs, press, and of course education policies, and this spreading of universities all over Turkey. Because, youngsters after graduation, they take a centrally organized, administered university examination. You can be from Diyarbakir, you can win a university somewhere in the Black Sea. So you have to leave everything and go there for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, depending on the kind of education you want to get. You can have a job afterwards. You can settle and marry someone from that neighborhood. So what does it make you? I mean, you can be a Kurdish, but you would marry a girl, for example, from Trabzon region, a different kind in Turkey. So that mixing is already there. So in my view, because in West, usually everything, especially in Germany, in classified